Now, if you're not saying that contemplative realism is the way forward for Catholic literature, it does seem like you're saying contemplative realism is the best form of realism.
I would, yes, assent to that. Absolutely.
And certainly the most Catholic form of realism.
Yeah, and that stems out of a difficulty that I have just with the limits of regular realism, as I call it. And again, I want to start by saying that we owe an immense debt to regular realists such as Henry James or George Eliot, Willa Cather, and at least some of her writings. Among others, regular realists, really helped the novel, helped fiction to mature away from its kind of sentimental proclivities, away from its more naive and I guess, for lack of a better word of putting it, kind of innocent beginnings, without, fiction that lacked a lot of kind of reflectivity about what the aim of the art of fiction is. But the regular realists, we can't say enough about what we owe them in terms of their exacting exploration of characters' kind of psychological contours, really wanting to get the human psyche right, not to portray kind of oversimplified caricatures, not to take us where we would expect to go with a given character because we think we have them figured out, but suddenly the realist would show us the hidden interior labyrinths of that character's mind, and again chase that character's consciousness or thoughts with a real exactitude that is just stunning. So you see that in Henry James all over the place, for example. And then also just a commitment to kind of take things as they are, right? To use John Henry Newman's term, which was also a term that Flaubert used and a lot of the other realists, just to portray reality as it is instead of as we wish it would be, as it is instead of as it ought to be, for example. So,
right.
Because if you go back in the history of literature, the philosophers and the moralists are always getting mad at the poets for describing things as they are, right? This goes back to Aristotle's Poetics, actually, where he says that the comedians, right, the comedians were always just showing characters with their failings, their shortcomings, showing them as they are, whereas the tragedians were treating people like a portrait painter would, right? When you're painting someone's portrait, in order to kind of flatter them, you show them a little bit better than they actually are. And so again, I can't say enough about that commitment to seeing things as they are. But of course, there is a real limit to regular realism, in that most regular realists were materialists, or at least agnostics, atheists, many of them, if we think about George Eliot. And that doesn't mean that they're unable to see and observe very carefully human nature. In fact, you could make the argument that because a lot of these writers had sort of foreclosed the unseen, right, from their canvas, they had dismissed the possibility of registering that which we can't see, all of these spiritual realities, because, as George Eliot would say, those are just projections of the human mind. They're not actually true. So it's almost as though with some of these writers, I wonder whether it's precisely because they dismiss the unseen and the spiritual realities that they concentrate so brilliantly, actually, on human nature, and they get a lot of these human inclinations and struggles and virtues even right in their representations. But again, that only takes us so far. And as Pope Benedict says, we have to, especially in a time like ours, especially in a post-truth era where there's this kind of sense of raging unreality all around us, right? We have to kind of re-examine what the real actually is. And Ratzinger argues that the realist who professes to be a realist, who discounts spiritual existences, is actually a realist only in appearance, right? Because he's focused only on appearances, he is a realist only in appearance. And
Right.
so that's where, right, sort of the contemplative development of the gains of realism needs to kind of come in and take us further.
Yeah. Yeah, because any claim to be a realist involves an implicit claim about what the real is.
That's right.
It may also involve an acknowledgement that this is a particular way of approaching the real, and that there are also other ways of approaching it. You know, a realist writer doesn't have to, like, as you were saying, you know, a realist writer doesn't have to reject fantasy as a legitimate approach to what is real. But you know, insofar as you are staking your claim as a realist writer, you still are making some claim about what the real is in a more immediate sense.
Yes.
So there's an extra literary claim being made there that anybody can evaluate to some extent.
That's right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think that is where, right, sort of the rub comes in, because you could, in the case of fantasy, you can always say, well, this is just a secondary world. And so if these fairies suddenly appear and they can work their magic, right, we automatically know that we can kind of let go of these questions about the correlation between those fairies and the world that we inhabit. But I'm primarily dealing with fiction that exists or is set in this world. Right.
Yeah. And so that idea of a claim about what reality is, that's what allows you to say, at least as realism goes, contemplative realism is the best form. That allows you to argue for it, because you're not merely arguing for one metaphor over another. You know, you're arguing for a philosophical position as well as a particular literary approach.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to cultivate a way of seeing the world, and actually it's just sort of a received way of seeing the world, not really so much something that I'm inventing. You know, I draw a lot on Josef Pieper, who says that man's ability to see is in decline. And if that was true 60 years ago, right, how much more is it true today? And so if it's true that man's ability to see is in decline, then not just artists, but all people, everyone, needs to develop a contemplative habit in order to especially in order to correct the technocracy that we live under, all of the temptations that would divert us and distract us from being able to see, behold, and perceive the real, to have the mind correspond to what exists. And Pieper speaks of contemplation as an attitude of receptive observation. And my argument is that someone who is receptively observant of reality will notice fairly quickly, again, if their receptivity is turned up to a high voltage, they'll notice very quickly that reality is filled with all sorts of apparent contradictions and tensions. And one of the difficulties with earlier or other schools of realism is that because we have sort of these naturalistic realists claiming, for example, that the real truth is that human beings are just these raw kind of animals, living animal existences, and civilization is just a sort of veneer over their true animal core, for example, then that's replaced with a sort of realism of manners, where we're just describing the difference in manners between Europeans and Americans, for example, right, and sort of trying to portray those honestly and frankly, and the clash between them, and all of the conflicts that come out of that. You have realist school after realist school after realist school, each of these schools claiming to be realists, all of them portraying different aspects of reality, and also portraying reality in ways that are in conflict with one another. And then what that led to over time is a sense that there is no such thing as the real, right?
Right.
That reality, when we talk about reality, is just a series of conventions. And those conventions will change if we move from New York to the Midwest, just as they'll change from America to Africa, just as they'll change from the 21st century to the 16th century, right? And so there's no such thing in that view as a stable nature. Now, I would argue that a contemplative realist gives some credence to these dramatic shifts that can exist across cultures, across periods of time, where the conventions of a given society are either grating more, sort of chafing more violently against human nature, or actually aligned with nature more harmoniously. And so one of the jobs of the fictionist, of the novelist or short story writer, is to accurately portray the distance that exists between our natural ends and the artificial conventions that are part of our time, our culture, are the limits of our place. But in portraying, conventions of the contemporary world, we're not saying that there is no such thing as stable nature. We're holding those two together. And there are a number of other sort of both ands that I try to work through in the manifesto. Another example would be that a lot of artists just in general have made, and a lot of these come from different realist schools, sort of claims about the natural world, the created world, as, for example, filled with beauties. And it is, of course, the case that, poplars, the leaves of a poplar tree sort of rustling in the breeze is absolutely beautiful. But there are also, right, sort of hovering above that poplar tree, let's say vultures who have noticed a deer that just got run over by somebody who was passing down that country road at 8 p.m. and it's dusky and they couldn't see anything in front of them. And right, we have multiple sort of convergences of beauty and kind of brokenness in the same scene. And I
just had a great car noise approaching as you were talking about that
exactly.
car going down the country road.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the world that we inhabit, right? I mean, you could literally be looking out at a gorgeous singular tree that is sort of revealing the creator to you, and then you have this sort of broken, busted muffler that's sort of polluting the neighborhood and giving you the onset of a headache, right? So at the same time, and that's reality. That's the world that we inhabit, is both of those things kind of conflicting with one another almost at all times, right? And so, Czesław Miłosz, right, the Polish poet, speaks of this in a letter to Thomas Merton, where he says, every time you speak of nature, it appears to you as soothing, rich in symbols, as a veil or a curtain. You do not pay enough attention to torture or suffering in nature, right? And again, very few authors are able to pay attention to both aspects of the created world and to hold their gaze upon both of those aspects in a sustained way. Willa Cather in Death Comes for the Archbishop doesn't really do it throughout the entire novel, but in the very beginning, she has Father Latour kind of wandering through the New Mexican desert, and he sees the landscape as what she describes as a geometrical nightmare, right? This kind of horrifying nightmare. And then he's troubled that he can't seem to find his way. He's going around in circles in this geometrical nightmare, and then all of a sudden he stumbles upon a tree that is in a cruciform shape, and he falls down kind of in awe before the beauty of that tree. And that's the beginning of him sort of finding his route again. And pretty soon he's greeted by the hospitality that he was in desperate need of. Right. So again, there are a lot of tensions that I'm trying to hold together in this manifesto.